The door groaned with the deep, patient voice of old oak yielding to the morning. It was not the sound of something breaking, but of something long accustomed to pressure finally deciding to move. The latch lifted. The seam of light widened. And at once the small world inside the hovel, with its stored warmth, its smoke, its leaping shadows, was parted from the larger world beyond the threshold. The air that entered was damp and cool, carrying the smell of wet soil, old rain, peat, and the faint, distant breath of fields still half hidden under mist. For a moment, the opening before you seemed less like a doorway and more like a pause between two conditions of being. Behind you, the room remained dim and enclosed, a place where embers slept under ash, and human voices had not yet gathered their strength. Ahead of you lay the path, a narrow ribbon of earth that curved away from the cottage yard and disappeared into a gray indistinctness. The whole village was still wrapped in a kind of half-dream. Roofs dissolved into mist. Fences were only faint lines. Trees stood like patient witnesses whose faces had not yet been revealed by the day. You remained at the threshold, one hand resting briefly against the timber frame, feeling the roughness of its grain beneath your fingers. The wood was cold. The cold had the authority of the early hour, a quiet authority that did not command but simply existed, and in its existence compelled obedience. You could feel it in the nape of the neck, in the skin above the collar, in the small parts of the body that notice weather before thought has time to form. It was the kind of cold that made a person aware of every layer worn for protection, of every stitch and fold and fastening that stood between flesh and the world. Your feet were already bound in thick wool wrappings, then enclosed in stiff leather, the sort of footwear that could endure mud for a time before surrendering to it. They were not fine shoes made for display, but laboring things, shaped by use and renewed by necessity. They knew the same roads you knew, the same ruts, the same damp hollows where water collected after rain. They were companions in endurance, and like all companions in a life of endurance, they asked for little beyond attention and care. When you lifted your foot, the morning seemed to hold its breath. Then you set it down. The mud answered with a soft, dense sound. Squelch. It was not merely a sound but a recognition. The earth took your weight and responded to it. It yielded, then gathered itself back around the edges of the boot with slow insistence. The sensation traveled upward through ankle and calf, up into the body's more private machinery of balance and restraint. It was a thick, honest resistance, the resistance of ground that had been repeatedly trodden, softened by rain, mixed with old hoofprints and footprints, and carried into its present state by the movement of an entire village's days. You lifted the other foot and stepped again. Squelch. Then another. Squelch. The rhythm became its own instruction. Step, settle, release. Step, sink, rise. The mind, which in other moments might have busied itself with lists and anxieties and incomplete tasks, found little to do here. The path demanded not cleverness but patience. It required the body to submit to its tempo. And in submitting, something inside loosened. The clenched inner life of waking thought began to soften at the edges. The village behind you remained subdued. A goat somewhere near the lane gave a low, muffled bleat. From another yard came the faint scrape of a wooden bucket against stone. Somewhere a child coughed in a sleep thick voice. A door did not slam. It simply closed with the dull finality of wood meeting wood. These were not interruptions. They were part of the same great hush. The morning had not yet fully committed itself to action, and all things seemed to be waiting for one another. The mist lay close to the ground and yet also higher, floating in layers that made the world appear measured and distant, as if someone had softened the edges of reality with a damp cloth. The cottages were not clear structures, but ghostly masses of thatch and wattle, their outlines dissolving into gray. The hedges beside the path glistened faintly. Dew clung to the dead grasses in tiny silver beads. A few blackbirds moved low across the field, their wings opening and closing like pieces of dark cloth carried by the wind. There was no sun visible, only a diffuse and colorless brightness behind the clouds, a light that did not illuminate so much as reveal by degrees. You continued. The ground changed beneath the soles. For a few steps it firmed into a patch of clay that held the imprint of cartwheels. Then it softened again into peat, dark and waterlogged, so springy underfoot that it seemed to remember every past footfall. A shallow rut held a mirror of still water. The water carried a broken reflection of your moving shape, distorted by the tremor of each step. It was a thin and fleeting image, but it stayed just long enough to remind you that the body was only borrowing its stability from the earth. This path was old. Not ancient in the grand, ceremonial sense, but old in the lived sense of something trodden through seasons until it became a habit of the land. It connected the hovel to the edge of woods, to the fields, to the patch of common ground where the villagers cut reeds or gathered fuel or led animals to pasture. It was not one road but many roads compressed by use into one. Generations of feet had entered the same depressions. Hooves had widened the softer sections. Rain had carved channels where water could travel. What looked like a simple lane was in truth a record of use, a map written not in ink, but in compression, erosion, and recurrence. To walk it in the dawn was to enter that record. The body understood this before the mind did. Your stride adjusted instinctively, shortening where the mud deepened, lengthening where the ground offered brief support. Your weight shifted from side to side in small and economical corrections. The ankles worked. The calves tightened and released. The breath found a measured pace, steady as a loom. One inhale for a few steps. One exhale for a few more. The silence around you was not empty but full of minor sounds. The pop of wet earth, the faint crack of a twig beneath the side of a boot, the whisper of wool brushing wool, the trickle of water running somewhere unseen beneath grass and stone. The cold air touched the face directly. It did not sting. It clarified. It sharpened the nostrils, awakened the skin, made the eyes more aware of distance and shadow. You could smell the field before you could see it: wet soil, green rot, the iron tang of damp stone, and that peculiar morning odor of earth after rain, as though the land itself had been breathing through the night and exhaled now invisible vapor. The smell had a comfort to it. It was not clean in the polished sense of later worlds, but it was honest, complete, and deeply belonging. The village was already retreating behind you, not in distance only but in volume. The slight sounds of domestic life fell away, replaced by the more elemental hush of open ground. You passed a fence made of rough stakes and woven twigs, its base dark with wetness. Beyond it lay a strip of garden earth where cabbage stalks stood like stripped sentinels. Their leaves had folded inward against the cold. A turnip patch, half concealed by mist, bore the squat, stubborn appearance of something surviving through hardship without complaint. Nearby, a small stack of cut wood stood under a tarred cloth. Every object seemed wrapped, covered, defended. The whole world was in the business of preserving itself against the morning. There was no hurry. That was perhaps the deepest strangeness of the hour. In later ages, dawn would become a thing of rushing. Clocks, trains, deadlines, machines, beginning their mechanized insistence. But here the day opened like a slow eye. It had no machine to obey and no fixed schedule to satisfy beyond the broad obligations of labor. There would be work, yes. There would be fields, animals, repairs, carrying, mending, feeding. But the passage from sleep to work was not compressed into a frenzy. It unfolded. It was allowed to be felt. This was why the walk could become almost contemplative, though contemplation was not always a chosen luxury. The body, pressed by cold and slowed by mud, could not leap ahead of itself. It had to remain in the step it was taking. And in this simple requirement there was a release from the inner noise that usually rode with waking thoughts. Worry about the day's labor, about the last sack of grain, about the condition of the roof, about the child's cough, about the uncertain mood of the weather. These things existed, yes, but in the mud they lost momentum. The ground absorbed urgency as if urgency were just another kind of moisture. You moved into a stretch where the path narrowed between hedges. The hedge was a wall of tangled life. Hawthorn, dead stems, damp briars, a few late berries blackened by the season. In summer this same place would have been loud with insects and birds, bright with leaf and pollen. Now it was subdued, its branches bare enough to reveal the wet architecture beneath. The thorns caught at the hem of your cloak when you passed too near. You brushed them aside with a gloved hand. The glove was coarse, patched, and already damp at the fingertips from the mist. It smelled faintly of smoke and old lanolin. Ahead, the path dipped into a shallow hollow where rain had gathered. The water was the color of dark glass. A film of thin ice, broken along the edges, floated on the coldest parts. You stepped through carefully. The mud pulled at the boots, reluctant to release you. Then it let go with a sound that was almost a sigh. There was a strange satisfaction in the act, a simple bodily agreement between resistance and motion. It was not pleasure exactly, but it resembled contentment in the same way that still water resembles a mirror. The land around you had a depth that was not visual alone. It was historical. Fields that looked empty had been repeatedly plowed, seeded, harvested, and left to recover. Woods had been cut back in old seasons and regrown around the scars. The clay beneath your feet held traces of carts that had carried straw in one year and stone in another. Even the mud seemed to carry time as sediment. The present did not sit cleanly on top of the past. It soaked into it. This is perhaps why the morning walk felt older than its immediate hour. A person could believe, if they were tired enough or reflective enough, that every step was joining a long inheritance of steps. The people before had woken in this same kind of damp. They had wrapped their feet against the same cold. They had listened to the same half-awake village sounds and stepped onto the same kinds of paths. Their worries had differed in detail but not in shape. Hunger, weather, labor, illness, rent, loss. The names changed, but the weather of the life remained remarkably alike. As you walked, the mist thinned in places and thickened in others. In one moment a stand of trees emerged suddenly, their trunks dark and vertical against the gray. In the next they dissolved, leaving only a suggestion of branches like charcoal drawn on a pale cloth. A rook lifted from one branch and crossed the field, its wings cutting the air with deliberate force. It did not hurry. It knew something of this landscape, or perhaps only that it could traverse it without question. The sound of your own footsteps became intimate. Squelch. Squelch. At first the sound had marked the ground. Now it marked time. The body settled into it, and with settlement came a kind of trance. Not sleep, not absence, but a waking surrender to repetition. The mind no longer leapt ahead. It watched instead the small negotiations of foot and earth. It watched the mild tug of mud around the soul, the slight wobble when one side of the path sank more deeply than the other, the way a thin reed at the edge quivered when brushed by your passing. These things became enough. The world, stripped of its loud abstractions, reduced itself to what could be touched, heard, smelled, and survived. The path led onward past a low wall of stacked stone. Moss covered the upper edges in a damp green velvet. Water had seeped into the cracks and darkened them. Beyond the wall lay a field half-rested, its furrows flattened by rain. Stubble rose from it in short, stiff bristles. A few crows moved across the soil, stepping with the proprietorial air of creatures accustomed to finding something overlooked by men. The field seemed to wait, its emptiness not barren but paused, as though it too had not yet decided what kind of day to become. You paused for a moment at a slight rise in the ground and looked down the path behind and ahead. Behind, the cottage had dwindled to a faint shape among darker smudges of roof and hedge. Ahead, the route disappeared into mist and low woods. The whole world had become a corridor of grays and browns, with only occasional hints of deep green where moisture clung to leaves or moss. It was not a landscape of spectacle. It was a landscape of endurance. And perhaps this was why it could soothe the modern eyes, accustomed to bright contrast and swift travel. Such a morning might appear austere, even oppressive. But for one who lives inside it, the austerity contains its own mercy. A world without too many options can be a world with fewer demands. The mud says, "Go slowly." The mist says, "Do not look too far ahead." The cold says, "Stay inside your body." In a life otherwise burdened by obligations, these are not small instructions. They are forms of relief. A distant bell began to sound from the village chapel, though it was muffled by air and distance. One note, then another, both softened by the dampness. It did not ring like an announcement of grandeur. It sounded more like a marker of continuance, a signal that the village had not vanished in the night, that time still moved in recognizable intervals, that the world remained in communion with itself. The bell mingled with the lowing of a cow and the creak of an unseen cartwheel farther off. Together these sounds formed the acoustic border of morning. You continued beyond the rise, and the ground turned softer again. Here the path ran beside a drainage ditch. Water lay dark and motionless in the trench, reflecting only the weak brightness above. Tiny plants, duckweed, moss, a fringe of winter grass clung to the edges. You could see where boots and hooves had slipped into the bank and left rounded impressions that would likely stay until the next hard rain. It was a place made by use and surrendered to use. The mud reached up just enough to remind you of itself at each step. Not enough to stop you, but enough to insist that you never forget you are moving through a world with texture. There is weight in the earth. There is memory in its wetness. There is history in the way it clings to the soul. The path does not allow the illusion of floating. It keeps the walker humble. It keeps the body aware that every progression is earned in small corrections. After some distance the air changed. Not warmer, exactly, but slightly less wet. The mist thinned and the shapes of the trees ahead sharpened. The trunks were thick and bark-ridged, their roots knuckled into the soil. Fallen branches lay half-sunken in leaves. A rabbit burst from beneath a fern and vanished into deeper cover. The woods stood at the edge of the path like a second and older world. Their silence was different from the village's silence, less domestic, more watchful. The village slept or stirred. The woods observed. You did not enter them yet. You only stood where path and wood met, feeling the boundary. The air at the forest edge carried a deeper dampness, mixed with leaf mold and the resinous scent of bark. The ground there was less predictable. It could become slick with roots, or unexpectedly firm under a carpet of dead leaves. It was a place that rewarded caution. But even before stepping into it, you sensed how the woods would alter the body's rhythm again, how they would narrow the field of attention and deepen the listening. The mud of the path was a teacher. The woods would be another. There was, in this moment, a subtle shift of mood. The open vulnerability of the lane gave way to the sheltering uncertainty of the trees. The path behind you still belonged to the village, the fields, the domestic. The woods belonged to something older and less settled. Yet they were not hostile. Not exactly. They simply existed beyond the scale of human management, and thus reminded you how small a village truly was in comparison to the full breadth of the land. A branch overhead creaked. Water slid from it in a cold trickle. You drew your cloak tighter and stepped forward, the boot sinking into a darker patch where leaf litter and mud had mingled. Squelch. The sound was softer here, swallowed a little by the woods, yet still present, still grounding. Every footfall seemed to announce not arrival but participation. You were not crossing a landscape so much as entering into its low language. The trees closed around the path in a loose corridor. Their branches intertwined above, creating a dim canopy through which the morning light entered in pale strips. The forest floor held pockets of wet leaves that released a sour, sweet odor when stepped on. Ferns bent under water droplets. Old roots lifted from the earth like knuckles of buried hands. Somewhere deeper within, a wood pigeon called once, then fell silent. The silence that returned afterward was not empty. It was dense with unseen life. You walked more slowly now, not because the path demanded more effort than before, but because the woods encouraged a different attention. In the open fields, the body had responded to broad, visible conditions. Here it responded to signs. The shape of the ground, the dampness of bark, the faint movement of things hidden. The eyes scanned low and high in turn. The ears listened for a branch that might snap, for the shuffle of an animal, for the hollow thud of a footfall not your own. It was not fear exactly. It was awareness refined by need. The morning had by now fully ripened into itself, though it remained hushed. Somewhere in the village, breakfasts were being completed. Pots were being scraped clean, bowls set aside, children bundled for chores, animals fed. Here in the woods, the day took a different form. It was not less real, only less communal. Each place had its own version of dawn. The cottage had its fire. The path had its mud. The woods had their dark stillness. You thought, perhaps, of the simple justice of such things. That every landscape asks something of those who move through it. The cottage asks maintenance. The path asks patience. The field asks labor. The woods ask respect. The body, in return, adapts. It becomes fluent in the grammar of surfaces and seasons. It learns the difference between mud that grips and mud that merely glistens. It learns the weight of wool when damp, the balance needed to walk a rutted lane, the small economy of breath in cold air. It learns what cannot be rushed. And so the walk becomes not only a movement through space, but a training in being. Your thoughts had thinned to nearly nothing by now, leaving only brief flashes. The warmth of the hearth left behind, the work awaiting later, the sound of the bell, the memory of the last bowl. They came and went without command. The rest was sensation. Boot, mud, breath. Cold, mist, bark. Step, sink, rise. Ahead, the path curved slightly and disappeared behind a cluster of thorn bushes. You could hear water somewhere beyond the rise, likely a drainage stream swollen by a recent rain. The sound was faint but constant, a low trickle that suggested movement without urgency. Even water, in this landscape, seemed in no rush to become anything other than itself. You paused again, then resumed, placing one foot deliberately after the other. The earth beneath you was cool enough that the soles could feel its temperature through the leather. The sensation was strange and comforting at once. It reminded you that the ground was not inert. It held the afterlife of weather. It preserved the cold of night and the warmth of any brief sun in uneven pockets. It was never just dirt. It was a living archive of conditions. The path widened as it approached a field edge. To your left, a fence of woven branches marked a boundary between cultivated land and the untamed verge. To your right, the woods thickened. The field beyond was a slate of furrowed earth, waiting. In some distant week it would receive seed. For now it accepted only rain and the tracks of birds. A thin mist drifted above it, and the rows of plowed soil caught the light in alternate strips of dark and darker dark. You stood there for a little while, breathing slowly. The body had become quiet in a different way, no longer merely slowed by mud, but steadied by the repetition of movement. A calm had entered the limbs. Not joy, perhaps, but the honorable cousin of joy. Restfulness earned by endurance. The morning had not solved anything. It had not answered the questions of survival or softened the labor to come. But it had done something subtler. It had made a place for the human being inside the world. It had given the body a way to meet the earth without resistance beyond what was necessary. And that, in a life measured by need, is no small thing. The path continued. The woods bent around it. The mist lifted a fraction higher, revealing more of the branches and the field edge, and the wet shine of the track ahead. You took another step. The mud yielded. The boot emerged. A bead of water clung to the leather for a moment and then fell. Squelch. The sound joined the morning, one more note in the quiet music of a world waking slowly. The day would go on. The fields would need tending. The village would wake fully. The animals would be fed and the tasks divided and the body drawn once more into labor. But for this moment, at least, the world remained in its dawn softness. The mud held its silence. The path held its line. The air held its coolness. And you, standing between hovel and woods, between sleep and work, between mist and field, stood also within the long, patient history of those who have always known that the earth can be both burden and comfort at once. The morning did not promise abundance. It promised only continuance. And in that, perhaps, was enough.